a hockey game at St. Mary's at the arena, and it was in the middle of the afternoon, and I parked the car in the parking lot, and I looked out my window, and here was this starling walking around with a couple of bands on his leg, and I said, like, I've been birding for 45 years, I've never seen a starling with a band on its leg. I said, usually it's these neotropical things that get caught in mist nets, but there's a starling with some colored bands on it. I can't remember what color they were at the time. But then, about 5 minutes later, another one, and then another one. And I said, what is going on? I had no idea, so I had to find out. The next day I did, and I found out that there was a Dr. Colleen Barber that was looking after getting her students all set up for banding starlings in Metro, and this was part of her project at St. Mary's. So I have more. And to talk a little bit about our speaker tonight, Dr. Barber is a professor of biology at St. Mary's and has been since she moved here in 1999. Her specialty is behavioral ecology, with her long-standing interest in mate choice and parental investment in birds. She and her students have been studying European starlings, these semi-colonial, abundant and adaptable and interesting birds, for the last 7 years. Tonight, Colleen will share much of what she has learned as a result of her studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Colleen Barber.
Thanks very much, everyone, for the kind invitation to come and talk to you about one of the things I love most. I've been studying birds for a long time. I'm not so much an expert at birding. I love behavioral ecology and figuring out why birds do the things they do. Can everybody hear me? No?
That microphone could be, there you go.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I've been studying birds a long time. And before starlings, I was studying song sparrows. But I was going to conferences with my students with n equals 12 nests over 2 different broods. So I'd have 12 in brood 1, 12 in brood 2. And we're sitting there and watching people with hundreds of nests. And we looked at each other and she said, you got to change something about this research program. It was taking us on average 15 hours to find these song sparrow nests out on a little hobby horse farm. So I thought, I get lost very easily. So let's have something where the birds, I know where the boxes are, so it's starlings were a great opportunity. They've been really well studied in Europe, but not so much in Canada. So I thought it was a perfect solution. St. Mary's at the time didn't have a master's program. It was all undergraduates, and what a perfect way to get students involved in research on campus and close to just us coffee and all that, you know, things they like. So, but the main part is, I've always been fascinated with starlings, and they're such an adaptable bird. They're very spunky, they've got a lot of personality, and so I thought, well, let's take the skills that I've gotten through my years as a student and apply them with starlings. So we're going to talk a bit about mate choice today. Now, just to frame it, my research program looks at mate choice. So how do males and females choose their mates? And there's social mate choice. So a bird, and when I'm talking about this, it's usually with the passerines, so the different songbirds. There's biparental investment, so both the male and the female will feed and care for the offspring, but they have to choose each other. At least one of them chooses. So how do females, it's typically females choosing the males, because the males are there defending a territory, and the females come and will sample several males and then choose to mate with one of them. Then there's also genetic mate choice, whereby with DNA fingerprinting, we're finding that there's a lot of nestlings that don't belong to the male who's feeding them. They're called extra-pair-young. So that's the female going out and copulating with other males and then laying his eggs in her own nest. So those are extra-pair-young. And there's more species that have extra-pair-young than ones that don't. So that's called, it's now no longer called monogamy, but social monogamy, because it's not genetic monogamy. So just very quickly, you can imagine, ever since they found out that, yes, birds have extra pair young, females are going out to get it. There's a whole bunch of different hypotheses that might explain why females are doing this. One of the things proposed by Trivers back in the 70s is that males can maximize their reproductive success. So how many genes they put forward into future generations by mating with as many different females as they can. Female birds are constrained, like humans, by the number of eggs that they've got. So I should say with birds, by the number of eggs that they can lay. So if females can't maximize their reproductive success by copulating with many, then they're maybe going to want to try to enhance the offspring quality. So invest heavily in those offspring and make sure they're really good so that they're going to be very attractive and give them lots of grandchildren. So there's different ones, there's good genes, and that's one that is intuitive, but it's got a lot of mixed support. It's basically that there's different quality individuals out there, and females are able to assess males based on different ornaments, so maybe brighter plumage or a nicer song, and all females agree on which males are of the highest quality. And those females, if they can't pair with those males socially, they'll try to get extra pair copulations with those males so that his genes are carried on. So that's called good genes, because those superior genes are going to be passed on to their offspring. There's also one called genetic compatibility, and that just means it's just that so every different pot has its own lid, so that females don't agree on which males are the best, but it's the best choice that she could make for quality for her genetic complement. Genetic diversity, maybe females are mating with lots of different males because they want to increase the diversity of their offspring. Fertility insurance, nobody really knows how viable wild bird sperm is. Some perhaps females are hedging their bets. They get very, their lifespan isn't that long. So if they miss a summer breeding because the male isn't fertile, it's maybe better to ensure that some sperm will fertilize. Recently, those ones are more genetic. The cooperative neighborhood is just something that's been published this past year in 2014. And they've taken some different findings that studies have produced and amalgamated into a hypothesis. And that's whereby perhaps females are going out mating with other males who are their neighbors, because then those males will think, geez, I might have offspring in her nest, and I better defend that nest if there's any predators that come around. So that's what the cooperative neighborhood hypothesis is. And so the first one and the last one are things that I'm hoping to look at. Now, my research program over the past few years has involved a lot of students, and a lot of them are all over the world at this point. And it's delightful to train them. This was my son, and now my daughter comes and does nest checks. I have to pay her to do them, but she loves them. And she insists that I might have miscounted, so she has to check everything. So it's lovely. It's a really nice environment to get children involved in as well as students. So we call ourselves Team Vulgaris. I used to not really know what vulgaris mean, and James set me straight. It means common. And so, yeah, just throughout the years, different complements of students help in the field. So this is our star for the show. Sturnus vulgaris. It belongs to the family Sternidae, and it, as most of you know, is non-native to North America. So a lot of people consider starlings to be weeds, kind of like seagulls or pigeons. And that's because they're an introduced species. They're native to Europe. Their populations are crashing in Europe. I guess over the last 30 years it's declined by 40 million birds. So there are problems, but here they're thriving. So back in the 1890s, a fellow named Eugene Schiefferlin was living in New York City, and he was from Britain. And he decided that his major contribution would be to introduce into Central Park, into North America, every species that William Shakespeare mentioned in his plays. So European starlings were in that play, and he introduced them. It took 3 times before, I think it was with about 120 individuals they took. And from about 120, we now have over 200 million. And they're even found in Alaska. So they're abundant, they're doing very well. There's a lot of, kind of, people think, well, they're aggressive. They are aggressive, they're assertive little birds. If you've got a piece of food in your hand that they want, they'll do their best to let you know. But their study just came out in 2012 by Kathy Martin at UBC with 2 other co-authors. And they found that when cavities are abundant, I don't know that they looked at it when they weren't abundant, when there's a lot of cavities, these guys don't have very much impact on tree swallow and mountain bluebird nesting success. Might be a different story if there's fierce competition for it though. They're semi-colonial, they like to be around nesting with each other. They're facultatively polygynous, and all that means is that usually it's socially monogamy, so one male, one female feed the offspring, but every once in a while a male's successful at getting another female because the nest box is close enough for him to defend, and that female is single. So she's mated to him, but she doesn't have anyone to help feed the offspring. They nest in cavities, so dryer vents, nest boxes. They have biparental care, both males and females feed the offspring. They have this really interesting display whereby they sing and show these hackles. So these are throat feathers. And this is what I'm going to concentrate a large part of this talk on, are these hackles. So they're thought to be sexually selected traits. With this song, I should say first, this is their distribution. They seem to be resident here over the winter as well. I get a number of reports from people about them being near the old library at the French Fry Wagon or out in Dingle Park, places like that. So you can see that they're quite pervasive. So this is our study site, a typical nest box on a tree, campus of St. Mary's University. We have only about 45, and we've been studying them since 2007. So just to show some shots of St. Mary's, climbing up to look into the nest boxes. Our safety at St. Mary's University has gotten very militant. So we now have to have a certain type of ladder, lots of hands and knees and feet on the ladders at all times. You have to take safety ladder training courses and everything. It's unbelievable. Every time you go out, you basically have to fill out some kind of paperwork. So with the starlings, laying starts in late April, and the males will help build the nest, and you can see actually some little, they love these purple strips, cellophane wrapper from cigarettes. Anything like that they love. You'll sometimes even find little cigarette butts in there. They have a clutch size anywhere from 3 to 7 eggs. The males and females incubate the eggs for about 12 days, and then the nestlings are in the nest for about 20 to 23 days before they leave. So this shows an egg pipping. So after about 12 days, they start hatching. And here you can see birch bark, and they have greenery, and the greenery is thought to actually reduce the mite populations. Different studies have found different things, but they have these volatile compounds in the vegetation that helps with starling nest success. And then you can see lots of feathers too, they gather feathers. So these are about day 2 nestlings. These guys are about 11 days of age. So when they get to this age, their tarsi are not so fat, so we put bands on them so that we can identify them. And we do lots of measurements on them. Now with starlings, in the breeding season, it's really nice because you can tell which ones are males and females by the culmen or the base of their beak. Females have pink and males have blue. So perfect. And also the females will have a little iris around the a little circle around the iris, whereas the males don't. So we catch these birds. We have something called a mow trap, and it's just a little square of wood with a hinge on it. I open up the nest box, put it in, put a stick so that it's propping the piece of wood up. Here's the hole, so it's propped up. The parent comes in. Here's the nestlings. It's got food in its beak, wants to get in, sees the stick, dodges up and down, decides, and finally goes for it, trips the stick, and we go rushing up with our ladder and get the bird out. So it's good because they're committed by that point. They're not going to abandon the nest, and they go within 2 hours, they're back feeding the nestlings again. So I should say we band the males with, if you're out and about seeing any walking around, if you see a yellow on the leg, that means it's a male, and if you see a pink one, that means it's a female. So we weigh them in a Pizzola spring scale to the nearest 0.1 grams. We take measurements of their leg or their tarsus, and then we determine condition. You just do a linear regression of mass against tarsus. So what that looks like, so this would be the mass of the nestling along with its tarsus length, and you can see it's a pretty tight fit. So when you do a regression on it, you get something called residuals, and if it's above the 0 line, it's good condition, and if it's below this point, it's not very good condition. So these nestlings here are in really good conditions because they were very heavy for their size, whereas these ones are in very poor condition there. If you guys have any questions at any point, just feel free to ask them. We also sit and watch the birds on milk crates with binoculars, and we do provisioning watches for 1 hour at 2 different times of the nesting period. And we begin once the first adult comes with food, and by this point they're banded, so we're able to see how much the males are contributing versus the females, and we know how many nestlings are in the nest. So since 2007, we've randomly plucked 7 to 8 throat feathers or hackles from the chest area and brought them into the lab and measured them to the nearest 0.1 millimeters under a microscope. So this would be the total length of the feather. You just straighten it up. And then they've got iridescence. So starlings, if you look at them, they're just gorgeous. They're blue, the purple, green, violet. And it's directional, so depending on the angle of viewing, it can change, much like male ruby-throated hummingbirds. So then also we measured the iridescence length because that's supposedly helpful with aging these birds. Now what we found with our data, we used the existing literature, but found for our population that any male that had iridescent length under 12 millimeters was a young male, and so likely a third-year male, because males seem to start breeding in their 3rd year, whereas females seem to start breeding overall in their 2nd year. So females have much smaller amount of iridescence, and it's less than 6.5 is young and greater is old. So we also collect blood samples, I know, but the birds are pretty good about it. They, after I've done all these things to them, the nestlings for one thing seem pretty oblivious, but the adults, they know what I'm doing and they'll look at me. When I release them to go, they'll sit there for a minute, and every once in a while one of them will just give me a good old bite before it takes off. So they're very plucky. I love that about them. We take blood and do DNA analysis because you want to find out which nestlings don't belong to the social male and see any other surprises that you might find.